On the 19th of February 2024, a 6-year-old little girl disappeared from Middlepos, an informal settlement in Saldanha Bay. Her name was Joslyn Smith. At first, this looked like a normal missing child's case. A little girl had vanished. A community began searching. Police were called. People across South Africa began sharing her face. And for days, the biggest question was simple: where is Joslyn? But then the investigation started to change. The little girl who had disappeared was no longer only being treated as a missing child. The people closest to her began coming under suspicion, and eventually, the person standing in the middle of the investigation was Joslyn's own mother. The case that followed would involve accusations of human trafficking, a reported 20,000 rand transaction, a white vehicle, conflicting versions of the events, drug use, a witness who changed from accused to state witness, and a trial where the court had to decide whether a child could be trafficked even though she had never been found. And the most disturbing part, even after 3 people were convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, Joslyn Smith has still not been found. This is the story of Joslyn Smith. Before we start, I want to give a quick disclaimer. This episode is based on publicly available court records, the official judgment, prosecution, and police information, and credible reporting on the case. Some details discussed in this episode were allegations or witness testimony, and I will clearly state so when that is the case. The court ultimately convicted Raquel Chantal Smith, known as Kelly Smith, Jaquan Appelis, and Stefano Van Ryan of human trafficking and kidnapping. But there are details from the case that the court specifically found were not proven beyond reasonable doubt. Before we talk about the accusations, the arrests, or the trial, I want to start with Jocelyn. Because sometimes when a case becomes huge, the child at the center of it all gets lost underneath the headlines. Joslyn Jacqueline Smith was born on the 23rd of October 2017. When she disappeared, she was 6 years old. She lived with her mother, Jacqueline Chantal Smith, who was also known as Kelly in Middlepos, Saldanha Bay. And the court judgment actually gives us a glimpse into Jocelyn's life long before February 2024. In 2018, when Jocelyn was only around 5 months old, Kelly went to the Department of Social Development looking for help. The court heard that she was reportedly in an abusive relationship and was struggling with substance addiction. At that time, Jocelyn's birth had not yet been registered. Social workers had helped her with that, and Kelly was also assisted with entering a rehabilitation center. While Kelly was in rehabilitation, Jocelyn was placed in the care of a woman named Natasha Andrews and her family. And this is where Natasha becomes important in the story, because the Andrews family became very close to Jocelyn. They wanted to adopt her. But according to evidence here in court, Jocelyn's parents were not cooperative with the adoption. Therefore, the adoption did not take place. But Jocelyn still spent time with the Andrews family. She would visit them during school holidays and often on weekends. The court heard that even when Jocelyn was living with her mother, she continued to have a relationship with the Andrews family. And by 2023, Jocelyn was in grade R. The court described the Andrews family as being very close to her, and this relationship would later become extremely important to the state's case, because the prosecution argued that this relationship may have been connected to the reason Jocelyn was allegedly targeted. I want to make something clear here. The court did not find that Natasha Andrews was involved in Jocelyn's disappearance. She was a witness. In fact, the judge specifically considered her relationship with Jocelyn and the fact that she wanted to adopt her. Now, at the same time, nobody knew that this history would become so important. Because in early 2024, Jocelyn was still just a 6-year-old girl living her life, going to school, spending time with people who loved her, and then came February. The court heard evidence about Kelly's circumstances and the difficult environment around the family. And I want to be careful here because this is where people online often simplify a case. The court heard about Kelly's history of substance abuse. It heard about her contact with social services. It heard about the environment around the home. But the judge also made an incredibly important observation during sentencing. Judge Nathan Aramis questioned whether the social services system had failed Kelly earlier in her life. In the sentencing judgment, he specifically reflected on the fact that Kelly had needed social services for a prolonged period and questioning what access she had to help when her grandmother had complained to the Department of Social Development years earlier. The judge essentially raised the question of whether society had failed to intervene earlier. The judge did not say that Kelly's difficult past excused what she was convicted of doing. Now, let's move to the days immediately before Jocelyn disappeared, because one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case came from a man named Nico Stephen Kotsky. Kotsky was an evangelist from Saldanha who knew Kelly because she came from the same hometown. In August 2023, several months before Jocelyn vanished, Kotsky said Kelly spoke to him about children. According to his evidence, Kelly told him that the town would become a movie scene in early 2024. People would be searching. There would be cars and people everywhere. But they would not find the child. Kotze said Kelly told him the child would be sent far away. Now, before you hear that and immediately jump to the conclusion that the entire case was planned 6 months in advance, let me explain the legal reality. Kotze was the sole witness to that August 2023 conversation. The judge knew that. The judge specifically treated that evidence with caution. But the state argued that this conversation became significant when it was considered alongside everything that happened later. The prosecution did not rely on one single piece of evidence. They argued that the small details formed a picture. And this brings us to Sunday, the 18th of February 2024. On the 18th of February, a detective went to the home of Kelly Smith and Jaquan Appelis. The detective was investigating the loss of chickens from a nearby farm. According to the court judgment, Kelly became angry that Jaquan was being accused. The argument had escalated, and this was not a small agreement. The court heard that Kelly broke a window and threatened to stab Appelis. After the window shattered, Kelly and Appelis went into the home. And according to state witness Laurentia Lombard, she overheard them talking about Jocelyn. Now, Lombard's evidence became one of the most important parts of the entire trial, but we will get to her. Her name was Paulina Tosa, and according to the judgment, Tosa did not know the people involved. She was simply walking to get her hair done. The path took her past the area near the Smith and Apollo's home. She had heard the argument, and she said she saw Kelly push Jocelyn towards the house and say, Exhalio vase. In English, roughly, I'll show you. Now, the judge pointed out that it was not completely clear whether those words were directed at Jocelyn or at Apollos. That matters, because I'm not going to pretend the court treated every detail as a certainty. The court considered the evidence carefully, but according to Lombard, something else happened that afternoon. She said Kelly took Jocelyn to a white Volkswagen Polo, and there was a woman there. Lombard described the woman as wearing traditional clothing and having distinctive white spots on her face. Based on the woman's appearance, Lombard believed she was a Sangoma or traditional healer. Lombard said Kelly then returned to the home with Jocelyn, and later she overheard Kelly tell Apollos that she had received 20,000 rand. Lombard then confronted Kelly, and according to Lombard's testimony, Kelly told her that she had sold Jocelyn. Lombard said Kelly also told her that she had done something bad. Lombard testified that she and Stefano Van Ryan were offered money for their silence. According to the evidence, Lombard was to receive 1,000 rand, Van Ryan was to receive 1,200 rand. Now, this is where the case becomes incredibly difficult to talk about because the word sold appeared in testimony long before the public understood the full legal case. The court ultimately found that Jocelyn had been exchanged and that accused were guilty of trafficking and kidnapping. But the judge specifically said that he did not establish beyond reasonable doubt that the exact white polo story as described by Lombard. The exact method of delivery was not essential to the legal findings. The court's conclusion was that Jocelyn had been exchanged. So when I say the white polo was part of the testimony, I'm telling you what the witnesses stated. When I say the court found trafficking, I'm telling you what the judgment established. Those are not exactly the same things. Monday morning, the 19th of February 2024, Lombard said she went to the Smiths' house. She found Kelly, Apollos, Van Ryan, and the children there. According to Lombard, Kelly said the handover of Jocelyn would take place around 2 o'clock that afternoon. Kelly then left with the youngest child. Jocelyn and her older brother did not go to school that day, and this becomes one of the details that the judge returned to repeatedly because different explanations were given for why Jocelyn was not at home. One explanation was that she was not well. Another was that her clothes were dirty. Another explanation involved a lack of washing powder or soap, and the judge later compared those different versions. Now, while this was happening, Kelly was employed doing general housework for Carlin Zegers and her daughter, Kelly Zegers. According to the judgment, Kelly Smith arrived unusually early that morning. She received keys to Kelly Zeger's house, but there was confusion over whether she actually went to work there, and later CCTV footage was reviewed. There were no recordings of Kelly Smith at the house on the 19th of February. Back in Middlepuss, Jocelyn was allegedly at home with Lombard, Apollos, and Van Ryan. And according to Lombard, something incredibly disturbing happened. She traded one of her bags for a quarter of a Mandrax tablet. The court heard that the three adults present had consumed it. The defense distributed some of the details around who exactly consumed what. But the judge noted that Apollos and Van Ryan themselves confirmed their involvement in drug use in statements that they have given. Now, sometime before 2 o'clock, Kelly returned to Carlin Zeger's house. She borrowed 50 rand and then she returned home. According to Lombard, this was when Kelly took Jocelyn to the car, the same white polo that Lombard had described from the day before. The court heard that Apollos, Van Ryan, and another man named Nico was present. Carlin Zeger's evidence indicated that Kelly was around half an hour to three-quarters of an hour. And then, according to the judgment, Kelly returned to the house at around 5 o'clock. Now, this is where the judgment becomes incredibly strange. Jocelyn was allegedly no longer at home, but the adults did not immediately begin searching for her. Instead, the court heard that Kelly, Apollos, and Van Ryan went to fill a petrol canister. They bought tick and smoked it. Apollos and Van Ryan also went to collect money for items that had been sold earlier. One of those items was a microwave. And according to the judgment, Jocelyn was not home, but nobody was searching for her. The judge specifically noted that Kelly had showed no concern, Apollos had showed no concern, and Van Ryan as well had showed no concern. Now I want to pause here. This is one of those moments where I personally read the judgment and thought, what the hell? Because if your 6-year-old child is missing, the normal reaction would be to panic. You would be asking where they are, you would be calling people, you would be looking around. But according to the evidence presented in court, that didn't happen immediately. And that behavior became part of the state's case. At around 8:20 that evening, Kelly went to Natasha Andrews' home. According to Andrews, Kelly asked whether Jocelyn was there, but Andrews said Kelly did not appear anxious. Again, I want to say this carefully. This is a witness observation on Kelly's demeanor. It is not a scientific measurement of emotion, but the judge considered it as part of the overall circumstantial evidence. Kelly and the another woman, Namshla Ntinzi, began searching. At one point, they went to a house on Peter Mokaba Street. And Teensy became concerned because Kelly stayed inside the house for a very long time. The search was not continuing. And Teensy asked why. Kelly apparently said she was charging her phone. And Teensy insisted that they contact the police. It was around 9:30 that night. Police had arrived, but there was another problem. Kelly did not have a photograph of Jocelyn, so police had to get one from Natasha Andrews. Eventually, Kelly gave a statement from the missing persons report, and the details in that statement became very important. In the statement, Jocelyn was said to have been absent from school because she was not feeling well. The statement also said that Kelly returned home at around 1:50. It said Apollos was not at home, and it suggested that Jocelyn had last been seen around 1 p.m. But Van Ryan was not mentioned. And this becomes a major issue because, according to other evidence, Van Ryan had been present. The police finished their work, and Kelly and Apollos had gone to bed. The search had ended for the night. The following morning, Natasha Andrews saw Kelly again. And according to Andrews, Kelly still didn't appear anxious. Now, I know many people are going to hear this and say, I would have acted differently. And honestly, I think most people would. But in a criminal case, a judge cannot convict someone simply because they behaved in a way we personally find suspicious. The court had to look at all of the evidence. And this is exactly what happened. On the 20th of February, Jocelyn's teacher, Edna Mart, had contacted Kelly. She wanted to know why Kelly had not been at school the previous day, but according to the evidence, Kelly did not respond. Meanwhile, police and members of the community were searching for Jocelyn. People were traveling from different places, residents were searching day and night. But the court had heard that Kelly, Lombard, Apollos, and Van Ryan did not take part in the search in the same way. The details became very important to the judge. That night, Kelly stayed at Kelly Zeger's home. And according to the Zegers, Kelly had showed no emotion and did not appear worried about Jocelyn. The Zegers couldn't sleep that night. However, Kelly was apparently sleeping very soundly. When Apollos was suggested as a possible suspect, Kelly became very aggressive. Now, this is where I want to remind you of something. At this point, the public did not know the full story. The community was searching for a missing 6-year-old little girl. But police were beginning to notice inconsistencies. Apollos had told the police that Jocelyn had a cold. He didn't mention Van Ryan. He said that around 11 a.m. he had washed the children's clothing. He said both children were at home. He had stated that Kelly came home around lunchtime and stayed for about 20 minutes. And then there was the question of who had been watching Jocelyn. Apollos had told police that he and Van Ryan took turns watching her. But in earlier accounts, Van Ryan had not been mentioned. And according to the judgment, Apollos became evasive when asked about his relationship with Jocelyn. He directed the question towards Kelly. Now, Captain Wesley Lombard had also interviewed Kelly, and one answer in particular had shocked him. Kelly told him in Afrikaans, Meneer, my kind is nie meer in saldanha nie. My child is no longer in saldanha. She continued by saying, Ek moet voortgaan met my lewe. Ek het nog twee kinders. I must move on with my life. I have two other children to care for. When Lombard asked how she knew Jocelyn was no longer in Saldanha, Kelly reportedly answered that the child was gone. The judge described Kelly as emotionless and detached from the investigation based on the evidence presented. Lombard wanted to take another statement from her, but according to the judgment, Kelly said she did not have time. She had to go to the spur with Apollos. And then there was another statement. The judge heard that Kelly said Jocelyn had made her famous. I am not going to lie, when I read that judgment, I had to sit for a second because the entire country was looking for a missing 6-year-old girl. And according to the testimony accepted by the court, Kelly was allegedly making comments about fame. On the 23rd of February, social worker Cecile Mbapo became involved. The Department of Social Development wanted to see what support could be offered to Kelly, and this is where the judge began comparing Kelly's different explanations. Kelly told the social worker that Jocelyn had not been gone to school because her clothes were dirty and there was no soap. But Apollos had told police that he had washed the children's clothing at around 11 a.m. The judge had questioned the timeline. Where did the soap go? Why were the explanations changing? Again, these are not questions I am inventing. They are questions that the judge raised in the judgment. On that same day, teachers were involved in the searching. Marth was at a filling station when Kelly arrived in a vehicle. Kelly reportedly told her about a call from a seer. According to the evidence, the seer said Jocelyn was on a ship traveling towards West Africa. But before Kelly had reached the vehicle, she quietly told Mart to remember that Bota, Apollos, was innocent. Now, this is one of the many details that became part of the larger picture for the state. On one hand, there were supernatural explanations being discussed. On another, there were people being told who was innocent. And the police were trying to figure out what had actually happened. Then came Kelly's sister. Her name was Makala Daniels. Makala was a police official in the Northern Cape. On the 26th of February, she spoke to Kelly. And according to the court judgment, Kelly told her that Jocelyn was nearby. She also told her that someone was looking to sell her child. But Kelly allegedly said that the informal settlement was too heated. When Makala tried to ask more questions, Kelly apparently told her that she knew Makala was a police official and that she was asking the same questions police had already asked. So Kelly would not answer her. Now, let me explain why this is so important. The state had already begun investigating the possibility that Jocelyn had been sold. And now the court heard that Kelly had allegedly mentioned the idea of someone wanting to sell her child to her own sister. The defense, of course, challenged the evidence and the reliability of witnesses, but this was the kind of evidence the judge later considered alongside everything else. When police went investigating, the public search for Jocelyn grew. The South African Navy had become involved. The community searched. A reward was offered. On the 24th of February, the Saldanha Bay municipality offered 20,000 rand for information. On the 27th of February, Kelly appeared in a Facebook Live with Gayton McKenzie. He offered a 100,000 rand reward for information. Kelly's sister, Makala, had also appeared in the live. At this point, Kelly was still publicly known as the mother of a missing child. But people in the community were starting to question her. Tensions rose. Residents accused Kelly and Apollos. Kelly reportedly said police had to protect her from an angry mob. People were angry, and honestly, I understand why. A 6-year-old had vanished and nobody knew where she was. Then, on the 2nd of March, Police Minister Becky Cele visited Middlepuss. The following day, police had announced that blood-stained items had been found in an open field. Now, if you saw that headline in 2024, you probably had felt your stomach drop. Blood-stained clothing? A missing child? People immediately feared the worst. On the 8th of April, police said the DNA from the clothing did not match Jocelyn's DNA. So those items did not prove that Jocelyn had been there, but they are not automatically evidence that the missing person was harmed. On the 5th of March 2024, the investigation had taken a massive turn. 2 men and 2 women were taken in for questioning. The names were Jaquan Apollos, Stefano Van Ryan, Raquel Kelly Smith, and Pumza Sigakwa. Police took statements, and 2 statements from Apollos and Van Ryan became extremely important. The four appeared in the Vredenburg Magistrates Court on the 7th of March. They were charged with human trafficking and kidnapping. The public reaction was immediate. Community members protested outside the court. People wanted answers. They wanted Jocelyn. and they wanted to know how a mother could possibly be connected to the disappearance of her own child. But the case was about to become even more complicated because while Pumza Sigakwa had been arrested, the charges against her were later withdrawn, and another woman was arrested. Her name was Laurentia Lombard, the same Lombard whose evidence would eventually become one of the most important pieces of the state's case. Lombard was a neighbor of Kelly. She was also part of the same circle of people, and according to the court evidence, she and the accused frequently used drugs together. On the 25th of March, Lombard confessed to her involvement. She abandoned her bail application. But months later, something happened that completely changed her position in the case. The charge against Lombard were drawn, and she was released, and she became a Section 204 state witness. In simple terms, this meant she could testify for the state with the possibility of indemnity from prosecution, but she still had to testify truthfully. And if the court later found that she had not been truthful, she could still potentially face prosecution. So, the woman who had once been accused was now sitting in court giving evidence against the other three. And I promise you, her testimony was intense. Lombard testified during the trial in March 2025, and she had told the court that she and the others were friends. They used drugs together. The group allegedly used Mandrax and a drug known locally as Tip. According to Lombard, on Sunday, the 18th of February, Kelly had received a phone call. After the phone call, Kelly told Apollos that someone was interested in Jocelyn for 20,000 rand. Lombard said Kelly later met a woman in a white Volkswagen Polo. She described the woman as being dressed in traditional clothing. Lombard believed the woman was Sangoma. The next day, Lombard said she saw Jocelyn being taken towards the same white polo. And then, according to her testimony, Kelly told her that Jocelyn had been sold. Lombard also said she and Van Ryan were promised money for keeping quiet. But here's where the defense had attacked her. Because Lombard had lied to police at first, she admitted it. She said she had been afraid. She also admitted she had been high during the week before Jocelyn had disappeared. The defense had argued that her drug use and initial lies made her unreliable, and this was not a small issue. The criminal case cannot just be, I believe this witness because she said so. The judge had to decide whether her testimony could be relied on. And Judge Aramis ultimately said something very important. He did not convict based only on Lombard's evidence. He said there was ample corroboration from other evidence and circumstantial evidence. In other words, the judge believed Lombard's evidence was supported by other parts of the case. And this is where the case becomes a mosaic. One tile was Lombard, another was Kotze, another was the changing explanations of the school, another was the conflicting accounts of who was in the house, another was the behavior after Jocelyn had disappeared, and another was the statements made by Aplis and Van Ryan. And the judge said that while individual pieces might look insignificant on their own, they had to be considered together. Now, before the trial officially began, there was a legal battle over statements made by Aplis and Van Ryan. The two men claimed that police had tortured them. They alleged they were assaulted and instructed what to say. The court held a trial within a trial. Basically, the judge had to decide whether the statements were obtained legally or whether they were used as evidence. This became a lengthy process, and the judge eventually ruled that the statements could be admitted. According to the evidence in those statements, Aplis and Van Ryan said Kelly had instructed them to take Jocelyn to Pumza Sigakwa. They said Sigakwa was supposed to give Aplis 20,000 rand for Jocelyn. But when Aplis had asked for the money, Sigakwa allegedly told him that another arrangement had been made with Kelly. The statement also mentioned an unknown man wearing a red shirt, and Van Ryan said he returned to Sigakwa's home the following day to get his cut. He said he was supposed to receive 5,000 rand, but he never got it. Now, I want to be extremely clear here. Sigakwa was eventually released because police could not find evidence to prove she was involved in Jocelyn's disappearance. The court did not convict her. The charges against her were withdrawn. So, when I mention her name, I am talking about what was contained in the accused men's statements and the investigation. I am not implying that she was guilty, and I am not implying that she was convicted in this case. Being arrested is not the same as being guilty. Being named in someone else's statement is not the same as being convicted. And the state's witness is not automatically proof that every single thing you said was true. The judge has to weigh it. On the 3rd of March 2025, more than a year after Jocelyn's disappearance, the trial had begun. Kelly Smith, Jaquan Appelis, Stefano Van Ryan, all three pleaded not guilty. The trial was held at the White City Multipurpose Center in Saldanha Bay, and the reason it was held there was unusual. The court was moved so that the members of the community could attend. The people of Saldanha had lived through this case. They had searched for Jocelyn. They had protested. They had watched the arrests. And now they wanted to hear the evidence. The trial was supposed to move efficiently. Judge Nathan Aramis wanted it completed within around 4 weeks. However, it had become an 8-week trial. The state had called 32 witnesses. The defense did not call witnesses of its own. Instead, the defense had relied on cross-examining the state's witnesses. And the issues raised included family violence, child protection, and sexual offenses. The state eventually closed its case on the 30th of April 2025. The court did something particularly important during the trial. On the 6th of March, Judge Aramis and the court officials had conducted an inspection in loco. They went to Middlepus, to the shack, to the area where Jocelyn was last seen. This allowed the court to physically see the layout of the area and understand the testimony about the locations. Because sometimes a witness can say, I saw her over there, but over there means something completely different when you're standing in the actual location. One of the things that genuinely shocked me about this case was how much of the judgment focused on small details. Not one giant smoking gun, the small details. For example, the school story. Jocelyn was not at school, but different people were given different explanations. She was sick. Her clothes were dirty. There was no soap. There was no washing powder. Then Appelis said he had washed the children's clothes. The judge questioned the timeline. Another detail was Van Ryan. In some of the initial accounts, he was not mentioned, but other evidence had placed him at the house. Another detail was the search. According to the evidence, Jocelyn was not at home. But the adults alleged went to get petrol, bought drugs, smoked drugs, and continued with other activities. Another detail was Kelly's behavior. The judge had heard that she did not appear anxious to the people who knew her. She slept while another woman couldn't. She danced at a prayer event. She allegedly made comments about Jocelyn making her famous. And then there were the statements made to police. The judge considered the contradictions. And when all of this was placed together, the state argued that it wasn't a random disappearance. It was a planned exchange. The defense challenged the evidence, but the judge ultimately accepted the state's case. And the reason is something I want you to listen to very carefully. The judge did not know every single detail of what happened to Jocelyn after she had disappeared. He didn't need to know exactly which car she was placed in. He didn't need to know the exact route that she had challenged. The legal question was whether the evidence proved that the accused had trafficked and kidnapped her, and the judge concluded that it did. On the 2nd of May 2025, Judge Nathan Aramis had delivered his judgment. The court had found Kelly Smith, Jaquan Appelis, and Stefano Van Ryan guilty of human trafficking and kidnapping. The NPA described the case as legally significant. Why? Because this was the first prosecution of its kind where the alleged victim was a child who had been sold and had still not been found. The courts found that Jocelyn had been sold or exchanged for slavery or practices similar to slavery. The judge specifically said that the evidence had showed that Jocelyn was exchanged, and that her freedom of movement and liberty had been unlawfully restricted. But here's what I think is very important. The judge did not simply say, Lombard said it, therefore it is true. He acknowledged the caution required when dealing with certain witnesses. He considered the contradictions. He acknowledged that the white polo evidence was not proven beyond reasonable doubt in the precise way Lombard described it. But he found that the overall evidence showed a plan to turn Jocelyn into a commodity and hand her over. And then he said that the state had proved the guilt of all three accused beyond reasonable doubt. Kelly Smith was guilty, Appelis was guilty, and Van Ryan were guilty. The three of them were taken into custody to await sentencing. However, Jocelyn was still missing. On the 29th of May 2025, Judge Aramis had sentenced all three of the accused. They were each sentenced to life imprisonment for human trafficking. They were also given a 10-year sentencing for kidnapping. The kidnapping sentences were ordered to run concurrently with the life sentences. The three were also added to the National Child Protection Register. And the judge said something that I think explains the anger surrounding this case. He found no mitigating circumstances that justified a lesser sentence. He said the accused had showed no remorse, and he said they had continued to lie up until the eve of sentencing. The judge also said that drug use was not a mitigating factor that could excuse the crime. But Judge Aramis also returned to the uncomfortable issue of Kelly's past. He questioned the failures of social services. He asked essentially what happened when she needed help. What happened when the system knew she was struggling? Could something have been done earlier? And this is why I think this case is more complicated than simply saying Kelly was evil. Because yes, the court found her guilty of horrific crimes, and yes, she had received a life imprisonment. But the judgment also forces us to look at the systems around vulnerable children and vulnerable adults. The truth can be uncomfortable. Two things can be true at the same time. A person can be failed by a system, and the person can be held responsible for the crimes that they committed. And this is the part that I can't get over. After all of that, after the arrest, after the 8-week trial, after 32 witnesses, after the conviction, after three life sentences, Joslyn has still not been found. The NPA itself said that its responsibility was not over as long as Jocelyn remains missing. The police continued investigating. a 1 million rand reward was offered for information about Jocelyn's return. Searches continued. The case didn't simply end because the court case had ended. And then, March 2026, police returned to Saldanha Bay after receiving fresh claims from a community member about Jocelyn's possible whereabouts. The police said no tangible evidence had been found. SAPS also said the investigation remains open and active. Detectives continue to follow information locally and abroad. So, as of July 2026, the official reality is this: Joslyn Smith is still missing. Kelly Smith, Jaquan Appelis, and Stefano Van Ryan are serving life sentences. The court found them guilty of trafficking and kidnapping Jocelyn. But the little girl at the center of this entire case has still not been brought home. Now, I want to talk about something because this case has been absolutely flooded with rumors, especially online. And I know, people love the dark theory. They want the creepy explanation. They want to say this is what happened. But I want to be brutally honest with you. There are a lot of claims made online about what happened to Jocelyn. There were claims about ritual practices. There were claims about a traditional healer wanting specific parts of her body. There were claims about her being taken across borders. There were claims about people who were never charged. And there were countless TikTok theories. But here is the problem: not every disturbing claim made in court was proven as fact. For example, testimony were given about Jocelyn allegedly being wanted because of her appearance, including claims involving her eyes and skin. But I'm not going to tell you that Jocelyn was killed for her eyes or her skin, because the court didn't establish that. The court had found that Jocelyn was trafficked and kidnapped. It did not find the exact fate of Jocelyn after the alleged exchange. And honestly, that is already terrifying enough. We do not need to invent a more gruesome ending to make a case interesting. Because the truth is, a 6-year-old child was found to be exchanged, and she is still missing. That is enough. Jocelyn Smith was 6 years old when she disappeared. A little girl who had a school, a family, people who knew her, a home, and a face that was plastered across South Africa as a country searched for her. The court case answered one question. It found that Jocelyn had been trafficked and kidnapped. It found Kelly Smith, Jaquan Appelis, and Stefano Van Ryan guilty. But the biggest question is still unanswered. Where is Jocelyn? Because justice is not the same thing as finding a child, and a prison sentence did not bring a little girl home. My name is Adele, and thank you for watching.